My name is Mike Duran. I'm the director of the Center for Peace and Security at the Hudson Institute. Peace and Security in the Middle East at the Hudson Institute. And I'm also a senior fellow. And I'm joined today by Gadi Taub, who's one of the leading public intellectuals in Israel and probably the leading voice on the judicial reform, which is currently roiling Israeli politics. We have senior officials in Israel talking about civil war, taking it to the streets, and other such dramatic statements. And we thought we'd invite Gadi here to help us decipher what's going on from his point of view. Gadi, you are a professor at the Hebrew University, which is the Harvard of Israel. And you were, until last week, a columnist at Haaretz, which is the New York Times of Israel.
Yeah.
But I think I'll read for our viewers here the letter that was used to fire you from your position. And this letter is from
Alon Idan.
Alon Idan, who is the editor of the opinion page. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm forced to write this mail after many years of joint work and alongside the difficulty of publishing your articles, which were unpleasant to many Haaretz readers,
Boo-hoo-hoo.
but which I thought were making an important contribution to freedom of expression and the possibility of being exposed to other and different views. Nevertheless, two things happened recently that changed the paper's stance on your pieces. One is the change of government, accompanied by an aggressive and immediate attack on Israeli democracy as we at Haaretz perceive it. The desire to weaken the judicial system through extreme unilateral and unrestrained measures compel us too, as a media outlet, to defend against what is perceived among us as a coup d'etat. In this respect, we find it very difficult to reconcile the dissonance, on the one hand, to be the spearhead against this coup, and you to be the spearhead against this coup. Haaretz to be the spearhead against the coup, and simultaneously to publish articles that provide a tailwind to that very coup. So that's you. You're providing a tailwind to a coup. In terms of defensive democracy, we believe that now is the time to go on the defensive. Okay.
By shutting me up.
So yeah, by shutting you
in
up.
defense of democracy.
So let me start with a simple question. Are you providing a tailwind to a coup?
No, it's striking that they call this a coup. It's the majority of Israelis voted for the right wing, and it was clear that they were voting for judicial reform and against the hollowing out of Israel's democracy by the Supreme Court. And now they're calling it a coup. We arrived at the situation we are now in through a slow-moving coup by the Supreme Court that usurped powers that were never given to it. And people don't understand how far this has gone. We're not really a democracy because the locus of sovereignty has moved to the Supreme Court. There is nothing outside the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court in its own opinion, including judicial review of what we have as a constitution. So if you want to imagine the hubris of our Supreme Court, imagine a US Supreme Court striking down Article 2 of the Constitution and also exercising veto over the appointment of justices.
Veto over appointment of justices. So basically, the Supreme Court in Israel gets to appoint other justices to the Supreme Court.
It used to do that quite freely, and then there was a slight reform, and now it only has veto over the appointment of judges. So it has to be an agreed candidate, agreed between the Supreme Court and the Knesset, the parliament, or the government at large.
Okay, but that doesn't sound to me like a great usurpation. Is that a word in English? Usurpation?
I think so.
Usurping? That doesn't sound to me like a great usurping of power.
No, that's just the end of it. What they do is they exercise judicial review over everything. So they can strike down legislation, they can prevent government action.
Let's stay on the appointment of judges. How are judges appointed? Because you said it takes place in conjunction with the Knesset. So.
Yeah, there is when they first arrived at this system, Ben-Gurion wanted it to be independent of the government. So there is they called it a professional committee. So in the committee, there are the committee is comprised of 9 people. There are 3 judges, 2 lawyers, then there's representatives for the coalition, and a representative for the opposition, and 1, I think, public representatives.
Okay,
And-
so the argument from your point of view is going to be that the justices on the committee that appoint justices, plus the lawyers, plus the opposition representatives, give an automatic majority at any given moment for
It's worse because now you need, there was a reform and you need a 7-person majority in a 9-person committee, and the judges are 3. So they exercise a veto over everything. When I interviewed the Minister of Justice who initiated this reform, he said, look, when the left is in control, there are 8 against 1 in the committee. When we win the government, they are 6-3 in the committee.
So it's always
So
6 to
they
3
do
against. It's
it's
6 to 3
always
against
for the left.
Yeah.
And this is why we have a Supreme Court that basically represents the worldview of Meretz, a party that did not pass the threshold to make it into parliament. We have an opinion that didn't make it into the Knesset, controlling everything, because they strike down. We'll get into it maybe later, but they intervene in the name of reasonableness in IDF actions. If the IDF comes up with a plan, the plan can be appealed to the Supreme Court, and it's a training plan, or it's a plan of purchasing equipment, or it has to do with shielding the civilian population from shells. And it can be appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will debate the merits of the case.
Now, this is something that I think is really surprising to an American when you hear the word Supreme Court. I learned a word by reading about Israel's system, judiciable or justiciable.
Nobody knows.
I can't remember what the word is, but I was very unfamiliar with it. It sent me to the dictionary, because you correct me if I'm wrong, almost anyone can bring a case before the Supreme Court
About anything.
about anything. There isn't a multi-tiered appeal process by which
No.
things.
So
the lower courts review things, and then it makes its way to the Supreme Court.
No, not just that. You can appeal directly to the Supreme Court. The results of the last election was appealed to the Supreme Court because the appeal said that Netanyahu should not be able to form a government if he's under indictment. And there's a clear basic law, which is our constitution basically, that says that he can, and they accepted it for debate with an 11-judge panel, which means they took it seriously. They should have said, this is on the face of it thrown out because there is a basic law about this. It says he can. No, they accepted it for debate, and everyone on the right was happy because they approved and they graciously let Netanyahu form a government. But when you read their decision, it says that the decision by the member of Knesset to choose the person who would form a coalition, which is basically the result of an election in Israel, is the very heart of our democratic system and should not be subject to the judicial review except in extreme cases. What? In extreme cases, they can void the results of an election. You read this and where is this hubris coming from?
So from an American point of view, we have a Supreme Court that gets to choose its own, basically. I mean, there is a procedure, but the procedure is such that the Supreme Court pretty much gets to decide its own composition. So there isn't really any kind of review by Parliament of the Supreme Court, and then anything can be, the scope of its authority is limitless. You're saying
everything is justiciable, said the Supreme Court, and if you want an indication, the Supreme Court in Israel gets to debate about 12,000 cases a year.
So
as opposed to 90 maybe in America, something 90,
I have no idea.
120 maybe. Yeah.
How many a year by the Supreme Court?
12,000.
12,000.
Yeah, these are the ones accepted. There are
so that's
67.
1,000 a month by my math.
There's a big
That's
backlog.
a lot. Yeah, that's a lot. All right. Well, that's quite amazing. Okay, now, um, so, but when I talk to my Israeli friends, I used to be a man of the left, and I have retained a few friends on the left.
And then
I've
you,
managed to, including in Israel. And when I talk to them about this, they truly believe, and I can say they're not being insincere or dishonest. They truly believe that the reform that they truly believe what was it Alon
Alon, yeah,
Edan wrote to you
that this is a coup.
that this is a coup. They truly believe it. You agree with me about that?
I agree that they believe, yeah.
Yeah, that they believe that. So, what are reasonable people who are looking at this on the other side? What's in their minds?
First of all,
You're probably not the best person to ask, but we might.
yeah, but I'll try.
Yeah.
I'll try. So the first thing is in their frame of mind is they're afraid of the religious, the nationalist, and all these.
Ben Gvir. This is Ben Gvir.
Not just Ben Gvir, but all these, the whole category of the right seem to them like borderline fascism. So their conception of democracy is not how do we express the will of the people, but how do we prevent these wild hordes from pushing us into the abyss? So their conception of democracy, the problem is how do you defend democracy against the most dangerous element, which is, of course, citizens. So what you need is something to control. And this is why all their discourse is about the tyranny of the majority. And their solution to the tyranny of the majority is the tyranny of the minority. Why? Because the minority is enlightened. That's...
Oh, okay, but there's a real issue here, though, is there not, of the potential for tyranny of the majority? There is such a thing.
Yeah.
I mean, in history, we've seen such a thing before, and a democracy does need brakes on the majority.
Yeah, but there's something wrong about this whole discourse, and I think that Americans often get it wrong too about their own country, not just about Israel, because I think it was Lewis Hartz who once wrote that the Americans have constructed
Lewis Hartz is a political scientist?
Yeah, the liberal tradition in America. It's my PhD is in American history. This was my Bible. This and Tocqueville, these were the pillars of Lewis Hartz is a real genius. And what he said is that the Americans constructed a huge machine of checks and balances that would never have worked were there not a huge consensus on almost everything. So the whole machinery is actually premised on the idea that they're working to more or less the same goals. So there is a worry about the tyranny of the majority, but I must point out that if the majority of the citizens doesn't want democracy, there will be no democracy. Democracy cannot be forced on any public. It's an illusion. And the illusion in its most vulgar way is Aaron Barak, or John Marshall, I guess, John Marshall on steroids, said that if he was at the head of the Supreme Court in Weimar in 1933, the Nazis would have not come to power. And so it's, by the way, a mistake, because the Supreme Court in Germany actually approved of the Nazis, and it had judicial review, but they seem to think of the world in these formal terms where he could have ruled out the Nazis and say, oh no, this is against the law, we're sorry. But there were 3 million SA thugs in the streets. It was not Aaron Barak would stand there with a paper and say, oh, you can't do this. So if, first of all, the Nazis never had a majority, but suppose they did, you can't force a democracy on anyone. Now, I agree that you need checks and balances. I'm all for them. But what they've constructed in Israel, the whole discourse in Israel, and I heard that even from Alan Dershowitz, which I think he should have known better. They speak about the Supreme Court as if it's not a branch of government, it's just a break on the other branches of government. And when you phrase it like this, well, of course, the stronger the break is, the better democracy is. So you can give limitless power to the break. But it's not just a break, it's a branch of government. And it made terrible decisions for Israel, terrible decisions. And it basically forces the values of a very small progressive elite on everyone.
Now let me take you back a little bit because I know a little bit about your views on this, and I'd like you to share them with everyone. You mentioned Aaron Barak. Correct me if I'm wrong, but he's pretty much the architect of this limitless judiciary, or a judiciary that has no bounds on its.
The Wizard of Oz.
Yeah. So, why don't you give us very quickly your understanding of the history of this? How you see it?
Okay. So first of all, it's not just my view. I think it's apart from the Barak supporters, it's the accepted view by legal scholars. Also maybe on some of Barak's adherents too. In 1992, the Likud enacted two basic laws. One was called Human Liberty and Dignity. The second was called Basic Law, Freedom of Occupation. And these laws included clauses that said that you can't make laws that contradict them. It never said that the Supreme Court had the power of judicial review. And in fact, the laws only passed because the promoters of the laws went around in the Knesset, it's in the protocols, and said there would be no judicial review. Don't worry, the Supreme Court will not be able to strike down a law. And these laws were passed. One was passed by 23 members of Knesset out of 120 in an almost empty house. The other was passed in a majority of 32 against 21 in slightly less than half full Knesset. So it was enacted on a quarter of the Knesset, basically, in numerical terms. And then it became our constitution. Because 3 years later, Barak, in an obiter, in a remark in another, he was sitting on another matter, and he remarked in his decision that these laws give the Supreme Court the power to strike down legislation. And he did that on the 4th day of the Rabin Shiva. It was 4 days after the murder of Rabin, and nobody noticed. Nobody noticed. So it was, and then he said that Israel had been given a constitution almost in secret, his words. So the court declared that we have a constitution. We didn't have a constitution before. Basic laws were not considered a constitution. They were enacted by no special majority. But now suddenly they became the basis for judicial reform. Then came the Esther Hayut Court.
And any attempt to revise the basic law will be struck down by the court. Is that the implication here?
Nobody dared. No, in fact, Barak said you can, if you want, you can change the basic law. But the Knesset never did, because the Knesset is always moderate, and the court is extreme. What we need is something to break the power of the court, not the Knesset, because the Knesset is very reasonable.
But why not just have a new law that will say that a new basic law that says the Supreme Court cannot.
What they're doing now is they're saying the Supreme Court can exercise judicial review.
I'm saying that when I want to have one that says the Supreme Court cannot exercise judicial review in this way.
The reform is going to say that right. It cannot exercise judicial review of basic laws, because actually the reform gives a lot of ground. It says, well, you took the power of judicial review. Now we're going to give it to you. We're going to legitimize this. Yeah. But you can only do it with a majority of the judges. And
okay, I derailed you. I took you into the reform. Let's get to the reform in a minute. Go back. You were giving the history, and you were going to start on the Esther Hayut
Court. But before, maybe I should remark on a small and important thing, is that, and we don't need to get into the details of how they did it, but the Barak court also gave the legal counsel to the government, who is also the attorney general in Israel, power to veto ministerial policy. So you have a legal advisor with the power to veto what ministers were elected to do.
And every ministry has a legal advisor?
Yes, and the legal advisor, like their boss, the legal counsel to the executive, it's called, the attorney general, can also prosecute the politicians. So basically, he's the defense and the prosecution. And one of them was, I don't want to use a too strong word, was
Go ahead.
bold enough to say,
we'll get
to
more
say
viewers if you do.
when there was an initiative to separate the two offices from the AG, so he's not, so there will be a counsel to the government and a separate head of the prosecution in Israel. He said in a symposium, he said, but if we do that, ministers will just do whatever they want. It took me a while to process this sentence. He said, what he's saying basically is, if I give advice and I can't threaten them with prosecution, if you don't do what I say, you're going to be prosecuted for bribery, then ministers will do whatever they want.
So in your conception here, the attorney general and then the judicial advisor, what did you call the
legal counsel?
The legal counsel in each of the ministries. You're seeing that as part of a whole system.
Yes.
Right, a unified system.
Yes, and they also, it's a revolving door.
But in your view, how are the legal counsels in the ministries? In what sense are they tied to the Supreme Court? What authority does the Supreme Court have over them?
So this is an interesting question.
How are they appointed?
You pointed to the exact place where there is a sinister connection, because this is all the same milieu, right? Israel is very small, so they all studied in the same law faculties. They all know each other.
They're all on a WhatsApp group together.
Yeah, exactly. There is a WhatsApp group.
Yeah,
There's actually an email list, and it's a. Whenever they say there's no such thing as a deep state, I tell my friends, just say the Shai Nitzan email list. Because there is an email that he sends to all the former judges. Shai Nitzan was the state prosecutor, which is the office of the state attorney, is the stronghold of, everyone's afraid of them, because anytime a politician wants to reform the judicial system, there's suddenly a criminal investigation. So
can you give us an example? Because now you're gonna. There's lots of people watching. You're gonna say, "Oh, that sounds crazy."
No,
that sounds like a
conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
Okay, so there was Reuven Rivlin, who was our president, who said, "This is not the rule of law. This is the rule of law gang, knufiyat shilton hachok," because he was going to be appointed Minister of Justice, and they opened an investigation, and it was open.
He was going to be appointed Minister of Justice, and he expressed it with an intention to reform
the power of the courts. And he had an investigation open for 3 years without investigative action. So he couldn't do anything.
What were they investigating?
It was some receipts that I think was suspected to. Apparently they thought he was trying to get reimbursement for something. And then there was Yaakov Ne'eman, who is
this was never brought to trial.
No.
So they suspended his.
Yeah. Yaakov Ne'eman is another case, a very prominent lawyer. This case got to trial, and the prosecution was actually reprimanded by the court for bringing this to trial. There was Raful, who was chief of staff, and he was supposed to be the Minister of Interior, which also touches on these subjects. So they intercepted him on something that's not even a crime. And when it came to court, the court said, we're not going to acquit him because there's nothing to accuse him on. What they said is that he misused information that he was privy to as a chief of staff, but it was something completely incidental and irrelevant to anything. And these are not the only cases. There was one minister dismissed for a kiss.
Okay, so let's go for what?
For a kiss.
That sounds interesting. Let's hear that.
It was a case of sexual harassment without harassment, because this was a female officer and she didn't want to complain because she was apparently flirting with him. But they managed to make a case of like a sexual crime, and then it was so shaky that the Supreme Court made this very strange maneuver, saying that he's not a sex offender, though this is sexual harassment, because they needed to. The question was, will he be disgraced? And this is a legal term I don't want to go into here, which bars you from serving in the government for 7 years.
Cologne.
Cologne.
We have. I looked up Cologne, and we have there's some English term which I always forget for that. But basically, you're disgraced and you're barred from having a public office for. Okay, but let's go back.
No, but I didn't finish to answer your question, which is how are they appointed and what's the connection? Yeah. And the connection is, since they are the same milieu, what they do, the legal counsels in the offices, it's they say, and this is impossible to translate. They say "זה לא בגיץ." They say you want to have a policy, and they say the Hebrew speakers are nodding. They say it's not. It will not pass the Supreme Court, but Supreme Court
it's not Supreme Courtable.
The acronym is Bagas. It's not Supreme Courtable. so these legal advisor and the ministers go crazy because you have a legal advisor that can basically block you from implementing.
But how does
policy.
that? What's the? But are you saying then? Because here's where it gets conspiracy theory-able-ish, whatever the word is. You're saying somehow that they are more
conspiracible.
They're conspiracible. They're more responsive to the Supreme Court than they are to the needs of the ministers. So I mean, when Office of Legal Counsel in our bureaucracies, usually they help. You say, here's what I want to do, and they say, here's how you. They the good ones tell you, here's how you can do it
legally,
which usually means here's how you justify it legally.
No, they answer to their.
But so what's the authority that the court or someone else has over them outside of their ministry or outside of their own personal judgment?
The strong link is actually informal. There are formal links. You can't move them from office. They're appointed by the bureaucracy. And they have, I think, 7-year terms. So if you're the new minister and you come into if we were ever to do a comedy show about this, it would not be called Yes, Prime Minister. It would be called No, Minister. No, you can't do this or anything else. So they're appointed for 7 years. If a new minister comes in, you can't move them. But the stronger link is they say it's not bagitz. And then you have a policy and they say, I will not defend it in the Supreme Court. Now, I don't want to get into everything, but formerly they had a veto on representing the minister. So you have your legal counsel that you can't change going to the Supreme Court and telling the Supreme Court he will not defend you. And they did this to Rabin. Rabin was the prime minister, and Aaron Barak wrote an opinion, which I think, Scalia once said, Justice Scalia said that whenever he wants to appreciate his own court, he looks at Barak's court and thinks, well, at least it's not that bad. And so Barak said that there's a monopoly of the legal advisor representing the prime minister. But the person of the prime minister is incidental, while the legal advisor represents the office of the prime minister. And therefore, the court heard the opinion of the legal counsel and never got to hear the opinion, the contrary opinion of the prime minister. Any thief can have his day in court, but not the Israeli prime minister, not in Barak's court.
Okay, on that note, let's switch quickly. I want to open up for questions as well, but I want to see how you connect up all the different things here to the Netanyahu trials, because you wrote an article recently in Tablet magazine, and you said that the election that just brought Netanyahu into power, back to power, was a referendum on the trials, and you see the trials themselves as signs of a judiciary gone mad.
I think American audiences will recognize this structure.
50% of Americans.
50% of them will.
Really, yeah.
It's the same in Israel. So I think what happened is that after Netanyahu won his 4th term, which was 2015, basically the leftist elites had given up on defeating him fair and square in the ballot box. So they put pressure on law enforcement to investigate him, and then and so started the thousands cases. Case 1,000, case 2,000, case 3,000, and case 4,000. 4 investigations of Netanyahu, all of which seemed very contrived. And what happened is they're now collapsing in court. Of course, the readers of Haaretz don't know this. Another reason to shut me up, because they have been complicit in this thing. These investigations started in Haaretz with investigative journalistic pieces, and then law enforcement pursued this, and And what they, in my analysis, okay, this is, you can consider this a conspiracy theory if you like. This was never meant to get to court. This is so sloppy. It was never meant to get to court. So the product,
The investigation was.
the investigation,
It was supposed to be
the
like
indictments are
it was supposed to be like Rivlin. So it was supposed to be an investigation that cast a shadow
exactly,
and prevented,
but more
had an
precisely,
electoral effect,
but
didn't actually ever go to the
But more
court.
precisely, the real product of the investigation was not criminal evidence, it was leaks. For 3 years, we've been getting bombshell leaks. Does that sound familiar to anyone? We had bombshell leaks every night about Netanyahu's corruption, many of which were just lies. And the press, and this is going to be the next piece, and I think it's going to be the argument in my book. It's not that the press had become slavish. Do you say slavish?
Slavish, I think.
Slavishable. To law enforcement. It's that law enforcement became the huge investigative arm of the press. So the press couldn't dig enough dirt on Netanyahu, so now they have the Attorney General and the police to collect any evidence, and they used cyber weapons on Israelis, which is illegal. They've completely broken all the rules in their pursuit of Netanyahu, and they've been producing leaks. So it's the exact opposite of Watergate, right? It's instead of some whistleblower exposing the corruption inside state agencies, it's now the press is the mouthpiece for state agencies to collect dirt on a politician.
Actually, Watergate was more like what really happened.
The real Watergate was more like this.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so the legendary Watergate is
the Watergate of all the president's men.
Yeah, So this hurt Netanyahu badly until in the last election, people began to realize, since it was collapsing in court, I don't have time to explain how, but it's practically amazing how sloppy this thing is. So it's collapsing in court, and then people began to realize that their elected leader is being framed, and they were angry. And so the last round of election was basically a referendum on the Netanyahu trial, and the electorate came back and said, not guilty. And so he was elected under indictment.
Let me just ask you some quick questions here because I have here from your article in Tablet. I'm not going to be able to get my glasses out of these wires here. Let's see. I said to you before, I do see that there is reason here to be concerned. So, like one of the proposed reforms is that the Knesset will be granted the power to overturn a decision to strike down a law with an absolute majority of its members, 61, right? And the reenacted law will be valid for only 4 years unless ratified by the next Knesset. So, I mean, if all it takes for a law is really just 61, isn't that opening the door to tyranny of the majority? Like, why not make it 3/4 to strike down a law?
Because then the opposition will have a veto power over the Knesset. And now this is not a theoretical question. It happens in a certain political context. And now you have an extremely progressive Supreme Court. And our problem is not the tyranny of the majority. Our problem is the tyranny of the minority. So in order to overrule the tyranny of the extreme minority, you need a majority of the Knesset. Now, what Yariv Levin, the minister, has been arguing is that if the court would be pluralistic and not extremely on the left, then when it strikes down legislation, this will be taken seriously by the Knesset.
It'll have more authority.
And it will be very hard to overrule even with a regular majority. And we have the experience of Canada, where it never happened. They also have an overruling clause with a simple majority of the parliament, and the parliament never overruled an overruling by the courts. So the expectation is that if we balance...
Because one of the other reforms is to change how judges are appointed.
Yes. So what Yariv Levin basically has been saying is that after this reform, we will have a reasonable balance between the three branches of government with the more, the advantage of power will be with parliament, which in a democracy makes sense. Now we have the complete opposite, in which in a crazy system, there is the judicial branch has completely subdued the government and the Knesset. And there is no check and no balance on his power at all, on its power at all. There is nothing that stands in the way of the Supreme Court. You can't balance it with anything.
And what do you say to those people who are saying that that this is a conflict of interest between for the prime minister, because he is still being? How long has these investigations been going on? Forever.
Since 2015.
Amazing, actually. But he is still being investigated, and he's pushing for this reform in order to exonerate himself.
The first thing to say is that there's no way that this reform will exonerate him.
Yeah.
There's the only thing that it will have an effect on his, the only effect it will have on his trial that I can see is it will aggravate the judges. And so I think that what actually happened is that Netanyahu was reluctant to do this because it runs against his personal instinct, because it publicly looks bad.
Yeah.
It looks bad despite what I said now.
Yeah.
And secondly, it's completely against his character. Netanyahu is conservative, not just in his ideology, but in his disposition. So he is mamlachti, statist. He's very formal, and he never touched the courts. So this has been pushed on him because what happened is that the electorate came back with a not guilty verdict, but they also pushed on Netanyahu and said, this is not enough. This is not about you. We're not about acquitting you. We are now sending you to reform the system that has been shredding our ballots. So Netanyahu got the message, and at least my analysis is that I know for a fact that he was reluctant, but he's a savvy politician. And what he realized is that when you're faced with a wave of public anger in a democracy, you can do one of two things. You can either surf it or you can be drowned under it. And this was clear ever since the primaries in the Likud. The primaries in the Likud pushed up the list everyone who was for judicial reform. So now you have Netanyahu, who is going to, in my opinion, if he doesn't stand behind this reform, this coalition is going to collapse. He's not going to be prime minister next week if he stops the reform.
Huh. And your view is that the chance of the reform going through is almost a certainty, basically?
No, because first of all, the elite that is now screaming that it's saving democracy is actually fighting for its oligarchic rule through the judges. Imagine, if you need a comparison, imagine that the very top of the progressive elite had the whole Supreme Court in America on its side, and there were no limits on its power. Would they give it up? Would Nancy Pelosi, at the head of a court, give it up? No, they won't. So they're screaming bloody murder now, and they're inciting. They are declaring that this will hurt the economy. They're calling it a coup in order to scare investors. It's not working. If you look at it from the Wall Street Journal, they're looking at the Israeli economy and they're saying everything is fine. But if you look inside Israel, the screams are Netanyahu is going to completely destroy the Israeli economy. They do demonstrations, they call for civil disobedience, and then it all depends on what will happen if they convince the court, if the court is convinced that there's enough power behind it to strike down the reform itself, which they're crazy enough to do. And if they do, there's no manual for how to get around this. Because the legislator is going to say, you cannot strike down basic laws and legislate that. And the court will say, we're striking down this legislation. So what do you do now? And Barak has been saying, the question is, who will the arm, where the tanks, who will the tanks obey?
Ehud Barak, former prime minister.
No, Aaron Barak, sorry. Aaron Barak is saying this. The question, he said this long ago, the question is, who will the tanks obey? Now, this is not going to happen. Nobody's going to order the tanks. And you also have to remember, Israel is a very small state. It's like a family. And whenever somebody warns of Israeli fascism, I tell them, you can't make 3 Israelis stand in a straight line for a bus. How are you going to how are you going to do fascism in Israel? Everybody knows everybody. Everybody's someone's relative, and it's not going to work.
All right. Okay, with that, why don't we open it up for questions? Hillel.
First of all, thanks for this.
Oh, wait, we have a microphone for you to broadcast your voice to the masses.
Thanks very much for the talk, and it's really very, very helpful to understanding what's going on. I have two questions. That one is from the beginning of this business, and now where you wound up, which is the calls for basically civil conflict. Going back to the beginning, when Aharon Barak began this initiative, you mentioned he took on Rabin also. Why did he do that? That's the first question. The second question is, how far are people willing to go in fighting this reform? Are they really willing to call out commanders in the army and ask them to call up their tanks to go into the street, or is this a lot of noise? Because the latter is really, as you pointed out, if you reach a point where Knesset passes the law to reform the judiciary, and the judiciary says, no, you can't reform us, there's no middle ground there. There's zero middle ground there.
So, yeah, it's an interesting question. So I have two responses. One is that this whole process, it's about how Aharon Barak amassed usurped such awesome power. The left lost the government in 1977, as you know. Likud took power from the old labor elites. And Aharon Barak saw an opportunity because the left started working through the judiciary, and he saw an opportunity for an alliance with the left where they would help him elevate the court because they could work through the courts. So this is how he maneuvered to power, and he also realized that if you take down a prime minister, he took down Rabin. Before Likud did, he took down Rabin on some technical issue of having a bank account, $1 bank account. He was, 76. He was an ambassador of Israel, and he had a private a bank account here, which he did not declare. And basically, you could pay a fine for that. But he insisted on having him fired. So he is, and I remember my father saying in the 70s, this is the most dangerous man in Israel. He's power crazy. So the alliance between the left and the court worked very well. And in a sense, what we're seeing now is, if in 77 the right took electoral politics and didn't realize that the left is entrenching itself in the bureaucracy, now is the final act where the right will either destroy the uber government of the bureaucracy, and it will complete the 77 revolution. So now it's a contest between the democratic state and the bureaucratic state. And this is where we're at, and this is why this reform is so hotly debated and hotly contested.
One other aspect of the picture you drew, if you have, in the Netanyahu trials, you also have the police then doing the bidding of the judiciary. How do you understand that? You explain how you understand the legal advisors in the ministries, how the court has authority over them. How does it have authority over the
That's a great
law
question. Through the press, because when when the chief of police was appointed by Netanyahu, he was ambivalent, and the press started berating him, and he was completely tamed by the press. The same happened to the Attorney General, and they wield extreme power. And of course, inside the police, the police became, look at what happened to the FBI, and you'll understand. If they are fed by one side of the political aisle with favors, and by favors I don't mean bribes, I mean granting them power, then they make an alliance with them. And in Israel, we had, El-Sheikh became a sort of J. Edgar Hoover because they started collecting dirt on politicians. And in the first round of this, in 2016, they exposed what they called the Yitzhaki files. And the Yitzhaki file, Yitzhaki was a chief of the police intelligence. And the Yitzhaki files included raw intelligence on members of Knesset. Now, raw intelligence, I don't know if you're familiar with the term, this is everything in the police database, everything that anybody says about anyone or any piece of evidence, and it just sits there. Now, if there's no investigation, nobody touches it. But if you start collecting that according to persons and files, and you have a ready file to start an investigation on every public official, then you're doing something illegal. You're threatening elected politicians. And so there was a huge uproar. And then suddenly the uproar died on the left. It just disappeared. I followed this because I went to the protocols of we don't have oversight in Israel. Our committees in the Knesset are just a show, and it's very sad. We need oversight. But I went to the protocols of these committees, and the committee that's supposed to oversee the police, suddenly the left wing disappeared from the protest on this. What happened in the middle? The Netanyahu investigations. That's what happened. And so the press started, because the police understood, we'll give you Netanyahu's head, and you give us a carte blanche. And if you look at the protocols, they stopped protesting this. So power is the answer.
Any other questions? Abe?
Thank you very much. It's been very interesting. I wanted to ask a somewhat more basic question about the basic law. In other words, what was the intent of a basic law? It seemed a little strange if it's merely a law passed by the Knesset that could be repealed by a majority the next day or the next year, then it doesn't have a kind of constitutional status. Was there any understanding that this should be a law that was different from the other laws and would override them in a certain way unless it was changed? And you know, if it's all just in effect the same thing, a law passed by the Knesset by a simple majority, then how does it get that status?
Great questions. You go to the heart of the logic of the controversy here. And it's actually a very strange thing. The Knesset in 1950 had a decision called the Harari decision, which said that basic laws are our future constitution and that they will achieve constitutional status only when the constitution is complete. So they are parts of a future constitution, and other than that, they have no normative advantage over the rest of the legislation. And you needed them because a lot of the basic laws, they didn't think of them as value-laden originally. Originally, the basic laws, there's basic law executive, basic law parliament, basic law, various other administrative things. And these basic laws are just supposed to explain how the system would work. So the basic law Knesset, for instance, says how elections will work. And it says that there's a very famous contested article, which the law, just if you want to, I'll use this to demonstrate how the court usurps power. There's clause 7a of the basic law Knesset says that you can't run for Knesset if you incite for racism or if you do not accept the Jewish and democratic character of the state. Now, the court forced us to accept Balad, which is an Arab party which is bent on the destruction of Israel and supports terror, because Aaron Barak said that there is not a crucial mass of evidence that they support terror, although they say so. So the joke was that unless Balad come into the Knesset with a bomb belt, they would not be considered by the court to support terror. So this explains what the status of these laws were and why they were enacted. Barak declared them to be a constitution.
This may be a little bit off topic, but I wonder if you've ever looked at the way the European Union has evolved and the role of the European Court of Justice, which reminds me of what you've been talking about here in the arrogation of power by the Israeli Supreme Court. Have you reflected on that and the role of the oligarchic rule of the European Union?
Yes, I have. I consider myself a student of your senior fellow, John Fonte, and his book, Sovereignty or Submission, deals extensively with the European Union. I've also looked into this because the European Union has found various ways to isolate Hungary and apply judicial mechanisms to it. And you're exactly right.
I didn't, pardon me for interrupting you, but I didn't read all of the letter firing you from Haaretz, because the other sin, you're giving a tailwind to the coup d'etat, but you're also an agent of Viktor Orban. Yeah. So I feel I need to, in full disclosure, everyone needs
full
to,
disclosure. I
that
am
you
an
work-
agent of Viktor Orban. And why am I an agent? Because I was invited to give 2 lectures at MCC. So the press is full of Gadi Taub is defending Orban because he's on his payroll. And I was invited by MCC. I got no salary. They didn't even pay my per diem. They gave me a shabby hotel. I had to take for a few days.
Don't insult your host.
At my expense, because I needed a desk and there was no desk in my room. But this was, it was an academic fellowship for 2 weeks and I gave some lectures. But this was enough for Haaretz to declare me an agent of the Hungarian government. And so whatever I say about Hungary, you should take into account that I'm compromised, right? I'm compromised. And so I won't say anything that Orban would not agree with here. But I'll just say this, that you're exactly right on the Court of Europe making everything justiciable. And they have this rule of law procedure in which they intervene in the internal affairs of other countries in a way that is completely illegal because the treaties of the European Union do not allow it. So they have this Article 17 procedure, and they're employing it against Hungary and against Poland. And some of their critique of Hungary and Poland is just justifiable as opposed to justiciable, to just justiciable. But turning everything into a matter of law is a way to insert international opinion or international values and policies and globalist policies over and against the will of the public. So they have this, and this is the subject of my book on which I gave a talk here at Hudson, was it a year and a half ago, is that the globalist agenda riding on universal values is then applying these values in order to undermine democracy in the various nation states. And the European Union is an it's exactly a case of what I called in my book, anti-democratic liberalism. In the name of liberal values, they're undermining the consent of the governed. And this is exactly how the Israeli court operates, and the same goes for Europe, who's being shaped by judges and bureaucrats, basically.
My main interest in this subject is really has nothing to do with the law at all, but with this international opinion aspect of it. Because
are you an agent of Erdogan, though?
I am sometimes an agent of Erdogan. Sometimes I work for the Elders of Zion. I'm a promiscuous agent.
There's a great retirement plan for the Elders of Zion.
In my view, there's one issue that's more important than all others, and I think the Prime Minister Netanyahu agrees with me about that, and that's the Iran nuclear program. I see the left in the United States using these kinds of issues to prosecute the disagreement over Iran policy. They use the Palestinian question. They use this, and
they also use surveillance.
And surveillance,
in the way that Israel did too.
So it's not. I see it not simply as not simply as an internal Israeli affair, but there's a global network, a global progressive network.
How does it protect the Iran deal, though?
Well, no, it's the
It should have protected the hijab protest,
No, if
theoretically.
if you're a Democratic with a capital D, a Democratic administration in the United States, and you don't like, there was just this last weekend there were attacks in Israel that are being attacks in Iran that are being attributed to Israel, and that puts you in a difficult position because your policy is to try to find an accommodation with Iran. You have two choices. Choice one is to go out before the electorate and say the Israelis don't like, Prime Minister Netanyahu doesn't like Iran getting a nuclear weapon, and doesn't like my policy of trying to accommodate Iran, and so he is carrying out these unilateral actions, and I don't like them. What do you think? If the President of the United States says that, the American public is going to side with Prime Minister Netanyahu because the American public doesn't like Iran and its nuclear program. Or you can say, oh, I have a real problem with Prime Minister Netanyahu because he's in league with Orban and Erdogan and all the ons against
and he's a proto-fascist.
Proto-fascist, and he's oppressing the Palestinian people. And that is a message that will especially resonate with that is designed, let's say, to resonate with Jewish Zionists in America. So it puts a wedge. It puts a wedge between between Israel's left-wing supporters in the United States and the Israeli government.
Very successfully.
Yes,
they did it very
Haaretz
successfully.
and the New York Times are.
And they also seduce Israelis. So part of my objection to the Lapid government was their subordination to the American. I don't, maybe anti-Israeli is too strong, but the semi-hostile Biden administration, they thought they can try that they will reach an understanding with them if they bow their heads. And I was thoroughly disgusted seeing Yair Lapid's Facebook page, where he is, I don't know, groveling to Biden. And it's really, how does a head of state put such a picture? He's making Biden laugh, and his whole body language is subordinate. And he made us a vassal state because they thought, and this is of course Biden's interest, because I don't want to offend your president too much at Hudson, but I judge
the president
Biden,
of Hudson or the president
of the United States.
Okay.
But I consider
You're known for.
I consider what Biden does at the beginning of a meeting to be most indicative of the rest of the meeting. Is that a nice way to put it? So he came off the plane and he hugged Yair Lapid. What does that mean? It means that he needs a picture, or his administration needs a picture in which the Israelis look happy about the policy. So he can say, we're going to the Iran deal, and the Israelis are not complaining. Why are you complaining?
Exactly.
And Netanyahu in Israel, I remember this because I was still on the left. Netanyahu understood this power struggle, and he came here and defied Obama and went directly to Congress, and that was a major success. It was a major success also because it signaled this enabled the Abraham Accords later, because the Arab leaders saw and said to themselves, here's a guy you can trust. Here's someone who's not, who stands up for his own interest, even against the United States or the president of the United States. So I think it was a real coup. He gained a lot of credit around the world for standing up to Obama.
You're supporting a coup.
Yes, I am. Once again.
Yeah. Okay. On that note, I think we'll bring it to an end. Please join me in thanking Gadi for a very
Thank you
interesting
very much.
presentation. All right. Thanks a lot.
A pleasure.